Hi, welcome back to Unit 2, History of Plants and People, with a focus on agriculture. And so last day we had a little bit of an overview of agriculture, and then we started to have a discussion on evidence. What is it that we look for as archaeologists or biologists that would indicate the origins of agriculture? When and where, and all of those types of things. Anyway, we talked a little bit about plant remains themselves. If we find an abundance of one type of plant, one species of plant, that might be an indication that there's cultivation going on. We also mentioned about domestication usually results in the change of the wild plant to have more desirable traits for humans. For example, we'd look for larger seeds. And we're going to talk about some other characteristics a little bit later. We also maybe touched upon human remains, right? We talked a little bit about wear and tear from agriculture because there's a lot of repetitive motion in many different types of agriculture. Wear and tear on teeth is actually a current area of research, taking a look at patterning on teeth. So for example, humans that ate a lot of grass actually have elongate striations on teeth, whereas humans, say, that ate more hard things like nuts and whatnot would have a different type of abrasions on the teeth. So that could be a good indicator. We also talked a little bit about coprolites, which are fecal, kind of fossilized fecal remains, stomach contents. And now with DNA technology, if we have remnants of biological material, we can do DNA sequencing and get some more information from them that way. Some people brought up the idea of animal remains because often, along with plant domestication, there was animal domestication. So agriculture was actually a combination of those two things. And so if we have evidence of domesticated animals, that actually could give us some indications that there's crop plants. Because if you have domesticated animals, you have to feed them too, right? So we came up with all sorts of different notions. Now, some of the issues around finding the archaeological remains is the environment conducive to preservation? And so, for example, being waterlogged or being really dry, or plant material being carbonized, in other words, being scorched or from fire hearths and things like that, that helps in the preservation. So just for an example, here's a quinoa seed, and it's been carbonized, and this is about 8,000 years old, and it's been preserved so that we can take a look at it. But there's actually really other things called phytoliths, which are microscopic. This is actually silica from the cell wall of a grass, and in some cases the patterning is very specific, and you can actually tell what species or genus a plant comes from based on these deposits of calcium carbonate or silica. Starch is also something recently that has been used in archaeological examination. So you can see all these different starch grains, and they have a very different appearance. And again, they can be good markers for certain species. And so there's been a lot of work, especially in tropical and humid forests, where preservation of other kinds of plant material hasn't occurred, but you have these water-insoluble particles still available in the soil. So taking a look at that microscopic view of plants. Another form is druce. These are calcium carbonate, and we're going to look at some actually in lab. If you get a chance in lab this week and take a look at a piece of pineapple, look under the microscope, and they have these little inclusions in the cell called raphides, little sharp pin-like things. Anyhow, we'll talk more about those later. And here's a skeleton there, and there's a piece of a coprolite, fossilized poop. And it's just an example of a tool used for grinding. So it's a grinding stone, a metates from Central America, used to grind corn. So humans, though, for most of their existence, Homo sapiens, for most of their existence on this planet, were called hunter and gatherers because they basically were more or less nomadic people who would go and would be hunting and be doing and collecting plant material. They would have had to have a keen understanding of the cycles of both animals and plants to be able to know when, where to collect them, right? And today we have a couple societies that are considered hunter-gatherers currently. the Kung people from Africa. If any of you've seen the old movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy, that's the people. They're nomadic people from Africa around Namibia, and they continue to this day to be hunter-gatherers, although their diet has to be supplemented because their territory is heavily restricted and their game is not what it was before, what it used to be. A lot of people would interpret our First Nations people as being hunter-gatherers, and I'm going to save that discussion for later. I was going to talk about it now, but I'm going to save it for later because I think it's nicer to do this kind of thing face-to-face. But I just thought I'd show you, this is Yan, which is in Haida Gwaii, and this is actually the setting for the film The Knife's Edge. I don't know if any of you have seen that film. It's really excellent, and this is where it was filmed, just to give you some perspective there. And the other thing I would like to also mention is that during our history, we have been a very nomadic people, and we have wandered around the world. We have inhabited all parts of the world, coming out of Africa, as we've talked about before. And what I think is kind of interesting, and we're going to revisit this, is we have this whole idea of a paleo diet, about going back to those times, although Paleozoic is way before even Homo sapiens were around, but the paleo diet before agriculture, before the domestication of plants. But what's kind of ironic is that many of the plants pictured here have actually been modified during and through agriculture. So anyway, I find that kind of funny. But we're going to come back and talk about that whole idea of the paleo diet and food. But hunter-gatherers, when we take a look at the fossil record, we take a look at remains, we see that they actually had a very well-balanced diet. And maybe not so much when agriculture came on the scene, as then we had a much more restrictive diet. But you're going to discuss this a little bit later. So around about 10,000-ish years ago, things changed, and all of a sudden people went from being hunter-gatherers to adopting agriculture in many, many parts of the world around the same time. So now we're going to talk about origins of agriculture. When did it start? And I just mentioned that around 10,000 years ago, many areas of the world started to convert to an agricultural type of society, which generally meant that we went from our wandering ways into settling down and cultivating the land. You can see all the different areas here. We have Eastern North America, we have Central America, we have South America, Africa, the Near East, India, and China, as well as New Guinea. So these are called the centers of origin of agriculture. Why did it start? Well, oftentimes we have this idea of the push me, pull you. Were you pushed into it because of necessity, or were you pulled into it by choice? In most belief systems, agriculture was actually a gift from the gods. That is, except for Christianity, right? Adam and Eve got kind of shoved out of heaven. But in most other cultures, it was a gift of the gods. This is Chichen Itza in Mexico. And in Mexican and Aztec belief, it is the god. There's a god. This is Quetzalcoatl, one of the main gods, and he is showing people how to grow corn. And there would be a separate corn god as well. Kukulkan is the Mayan god, the equivalent to the Mayan god. So as we discussed last day, was the beginning of agriculture kind of like an aha moment? You know, we talked about the dump heap hypothesis, where you notice, oh, there's some seeds germinating in a dump heap or a garbage, in the garbage heap. And you say, aha, I understand how to do this, and then you start to grow plants. So that's one idea. Another one is a natural progression. Is it part of human evolution, where it was an inevitable outcome? We start hunting and gathering, we cultivate at a small scale, cultivate at a larger scale, and then have full-blown agriculture where we become very dependent on these plants that we've domesticated. So we go from dependence on wild plants to a decreasing dependence on wild plants with an increasing dependence on plant domestication. is this kind of a natural progression for humans? Who knows? Was it a choice that humans just decided that that would be a good thing to do? Or is it a necessity? Necessity is the mother of invention because we had to. And as it turns out, it's kind of interesting, around that same time that we were adopting agriculture was the time of the extinction of a lot of the large mammals that we would have perhaps used as game. But what most people are now looking at is this whole idea of the environment and the environmental changes that have been occurring. And what's been kind of neat in the Near East, I'll show you a map of that in a second, they've been taking a look at archaeological remains of a group of people called the Natufians. And what was interesting about them was that they actually became sedentary before they adopted agriculture. So they settled down, they were still getting wild plants, and then they adopted agriculture after that. So taking a look at that transition by looking at the archaeological remains. And they're kind of interesting because there are lots of them. One may be because of the environment, it's very dry, so there's a lot of preservation, but their habitations were also kind of underground, and so were easily covered and preserved. And the period that we see where we have some major climatic changes is called the Dryas period, or the Younger Dryas period. And that's due to this plant here, Dryas octopetala, which changed its range, and so people could tell that, or plant remains, you could tell that there was a change in climate because of the change of distribution of this plant. And so that's where the Dryas periods get their name from. So around the world, we started out hunter-gatherers, and then around this 10,000 period, we got this what's called the agricultural revolution, where there's many different places around the world that adopted agriculture. And then with agriculture came an increase in technologies, more metalworking, we get irrigation plowing, and then we get populations increasing. This is population. And then after the Industrial Revolution here, we get a marked increase in population. So that's kind of just a timeline for humans there. So where agriculture started, well, it didn't start in one place. It started in a number of different places around the world, all around the same time. And what you'll notice is that it often isn't just one crop that was adopted, but a number of crops that were adopted. So for example, in northern South America, we have the squash, arrowroot, yam, cotton, sweet potato, the dreaded lima bean, and Lorraine, which is actually Tipitambo is another name for it, which I think is a really cool name. Tipitambo actually, even though it was one of the earliest crops that was domesticated, it actually did get spread very far. So it's mostly in South America and in the Caribbean that it's grown. And here's another map just showing you a couple of things, a little bit more like a sequence. So we have some areas that were developed in the early Holocene, other ones in the middle Holocene, and the solid line around those colors indicating that they're widely accepted centers of domestication. The brown areas indicating what's inferred, meaning that there are domesticated plants there, but there's not really any archaeological data. It's sort of what we see today, and we infer that that was an area of domestication. So a little bit of research to do there, I guess. And the Fertile Crescent is this region here. I'm just going to get a black pen here. Is this region here called a crescent because it's shaped like a crescent. You can see it's associated with the Euphrates and Tigris rivers right in here. So you guys may have read a little bit about this area. As a kid, I did, about Mesopotamia. So this is Mesopotamia and down here where the Natufians actually were. So remember, those are the people who actually started to have a sedentary lifestyle before agriculture. Usually those things went together, as we talked about in class the other day. You're going to be reading a paper a little bit later. Well, actually it's a sign now, and you're going to be taking a look at this Fertile Crescent a little bit and taking a look at the cereals. So the green color here talks about cereals that have that there's evidence for cereals that were not cultivated, and cultivation evidences in the blue. So I'm going to let you take a look at that. So you're going to have a reading assignment, and you'll see that it's posted with the lecture notes for this unit. So if you think about it, collecting grasses, that is a pretty tough thing to do. Just going and collecting those seed heads or fruit heads. And today, of course, we see great wheat fields. And so this domestication of wheat actually became really important and was one of the first crops. There's a bit of controversy, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later, and when we go on our Arboretum tour perhaps, about figs. And so there's some evidence that figs were actually grown purposefully earlier than the adoption of cereal agriculture. Cereal meaning things like wheat and barley and that type of thing. But we'll talk about that later. So here you can see there are many different kinds of wheat. So you've got wild emmer, domesticated emmer, durum, common wheat. So this is the most common plant grown on the planet actually, and you'll notice that they have different genetic makeups here. And what I want to just show you is that this is due to crossing. So we have einkorn wheat, which has got AA, and then we have another type of grass called BB. They get crossed together, and we end up with what's called emmer and durum wheat. So we have the BBAA. So these are double complement of genetic material. So we have what are called tetraploids, meaning that they have more than one set of chromosomes. Remember, we talked about being 2N. Well, these are actually 4N. And so polyploidy comes into many of our domesticated crops, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I just want to also mention that we have what's called a domestication syndrome. And this is a combination of features that were selected for by humans. So if we took a look at wild emmer right here, what you'll see is they have what's called a brittle rachis. And in a wild grass, what happens when the fruits are mature is that the fruits just shatter. So it's called shattering. They fall off easily from the stalk, and that helps them to disperse. So that's their dispersal mechanism. But it makes it really tough to collect the grasses, right? And when you're collecting them, they start shattering on you. How do you collect all of those yummy fruits, right? So basically, humans have selected for lines in which they don't shatter. So they're said to be non-brittle. So when you collect them, they don't fall off. And so that's what we have with the domesticated emmer. And as well the durum wheat and the common wheat. So they all have these fruit heads that don't shatter. Okay, they're non-brittle. We also have this selection for naked grains. So in the wilder type of grains, we have lots of different kind of leaf-like coverings that protect them. But through selection, humans have selected against those. So we have these naked grains that makes them easier for harvesting and processing. Now, so these wheats, you can see the distribution of all of these wheats was in the Fertile Crescent here. And if we take a look at the distribution today of wheat, we see that it's all over the world. So it's gone from that Fertile Crescent to be everywhere, the most important crop on the planet. Now, if we take a look at that Fertile Crescent, we see that there's this combination of plants, einkorn wheat, emmer wheat. We also have barley, peas, lentils, vetch, and they were likely edible in their wild state. Later on, we have chickpeas, melons, walnuts, olives. We have walnuts again. I guess they're pretty yummy, and pistachios. And then along with that, we have the domestication of dogs, goats, sheep, and yes, cats. Way back when, about 9,000 years ago. And later on, cattle, pigs, and then camels. But camels, I don't know. I've never really met a friendly camel. I don't know how domesticated they get. But anywho, but you can see that in this area, there were a lot of animals that are conducive to domestication. And the same thing with this Fertile Crescent. There were plants that were conducive to domestication. So it's it's a little bit about also what's available in that environment. Now, most of the grasses, as I've mentioned, have undergone this domestication, with one exception, and some of you may have tried teff flower. Teff actually pretty much looks like what it always has looked like. It hasn't undergone any domestication syndromes. Teff is used to make, if you've ever gone out to an Ethiopian restaurant and eaten with the bread, that's made with teff. Now, this is a very funny illustration. The land is in blue and the water's in beige, so that's kind of weird. But it's basically showing you that here we have this Fertile Crescent starting this agriculture as a technology, and the technology has moved away. People have adopted this agricultural system, sometimes with similar plants, sometimes with very different plants. Okay, well, let's take a look at another region. If we take a look over in the Far East, which is in China, we have actually two different areas that adopted agriculture quite a long time ago. And of course, you're not surprised that one of the earliest crops was rice. And rice started in a drier form, and then they do upland rice, lowland rice, and so on and so forth. And again, we have this domestication for different heights of plants. Shorter plants are easier to harvest, for example. And again, the adoption of some kind of livestock. So, for example, water buffalo would have been used. So, in the Far East, around Yellow River, the Yangtze River in China, we have plants such as rice and millet and hemp. And there could have been some early root vegetables as well, but the thing is that they may not be conducive to preservation, so we don't really know very much about that. Domesticated animals would have included cattle, pigs, dogs, and poultry as well. If we took a look at Central America, we have the squash, the maize, and the corn. These are called the Three Sisters. So corn, of course, you're going to take a look at that a little bit in lab this week. It's monoecious. It's got the female flowers in the cobs down below here. You're going to learn a little bit more about that. And the male flowers up here. So these are called the silks, those silky things, which are the stigmastyles of the corn flowers. And then we also have what are called the tassels, the male flowers up above. There we go, there are the silks. And we have lots and lots of different races of corn. We get very few here, but if we went to Central America, you would see a whole bunch of different kinds of corn. And I've got some real popping corn I'm going to bring in one day to share with you. Now, the ancestor to the corn doesn't look anything like corn, and there's no intermediate between them. And so there actually was this thing called the Corn Wars, and it got to be pretty heated about what were the ancestors to corn. Yeah, the Corn Wars. People were arguing about it. Well, as it turns out, and DNA sequencing has confirmed it, it's this plant here. So this is called teosinte, and it's very different from corn. If you take a look over here, you'll see that each of the kernels is actually wrapped in a really hard cover, making it really hard to process, and also there's not very many kernels per cob. If you took a look at the actual plant, so here's a corn plant here, they're actually quite different, and that we have many smaller cobs on a very much bushier plant. And some people believe that the plant was actually initially grown for its sugar content of its stem, kind of like a sugar cane, right? And that the corn cob that we see today developed kind of secondarily from that. We have no idea how one came from the other. The other thing is squash, and there's lots of fossil remains of seeds from squash to show us that how long it's been around as a domesticated crop. And of course, as I mentioned, the three of them growing together are called the Three Sisters, and nutritionally they actually are a very well-balanced diet, because corn itself actually doesn't produce all the amino acids important for humans, but that can be supplemented with beans. So kind of a nice combination. And as I mentioned, in South America, there's all sorts of interesting crops that originated, particularly in this region here, with the squash, arrowroot, and I think this is the lima bean area too, and that Lorraine, the Timitambo, in this region. And of course, one of the most important plants that came out of South America was the potato, and that was actually from a different region. The potato and many different varieties of potato, but of course we only see a very few in our part of the world, which it can be dangerous. Like if you think about we're going to talk a little bit later about the Irish potato famine, relying on one crop, and when that crop fails, disaster sets in, and we'll talk more about that later. This is in Ecuador, actually, a market I went to, and they had lots of different kinds of potatoes. Also, quinoa is from South America as well. You guys probably have seen that, and you'll see that again. Now, one thing I found very interesting when I was visiting in Ecuador, and I didn't know this until I went there, was that when the Europeans came, when the Spanish first came to South America, they saw people having these guinea pigs in their houses, and they thought they were pets, and that's where guinea pigs got adopted as pets, when actually they were being grown for food. And so you can actually still today find guinea pigs being sold at market. This is in Ecuador. In Africa, there are a number of different grains. We have millet, as well as things like sorghum, which we don't think of as being very important, but it is a very important crop in Africa, and it was adopted also in China. New Guinea, interestingly enough, this is lots of really recent finds taking a look at starch. This is the home of the true yam, of banana, and of taro. We're going to talk more about that later on. So what are the consequences of agriculture to humans? Well, what I want you to do is think about this a little bit. What are some of the benefits of agriculture? What are some of the negative consequences of agriculture? And we're going to talk about this in about 2 weeks' time, because we've got a few things to cover between now and then. We've got plant reproduction next day, then we got plant structure, and then after that we'll come back to this whole idea of agriculture. So I want to switch gears now and talk about the origin of crop plants. So some of these crop plants would have been important in the origin of agriculture, but not all of them. So we're just talking about the crop plants in particular. And often we talk in terms of center of crop plants. So this was the work of Nikolai Vavilov, a Russian botanist, and what he did was travel around and looked for these origin of particular crops by looking at the diversity of their relatives. And so he figured that wherever there was a lot of diversity, that would be the origin. And he came up with 6 or 8 centers, geographic locations where crop plants would have originated from. We don't really think in terms right now of centers, but it's kind of a good way of looking at it, broad geographic regions, and thinking about what plants originated there. But poor old Nikolai, he did most of his work between 1916 and 1936, and then actually went to jail for his support of the Mendelian genetics, and then died a martyr in prison. So he met a bad end. Some of these botanists, man, yep, die young. Anyhow, so I'd like to guarantee you an exam question. So name 2 crops from a given region of the world, we're going to look at those in a minute, and provide their scientific names, plant family, and parts of the plants that are eaten or used. So for example, cotton isn't eaten, it's used in textiles, so you could use that type of plant. Okay, so just pick a couple, and you might want to wait until we take a look at plant families and pick some favorites from those when in the lab. And so if we take a look at the Chinese center of origin, we have all sorts of things like rice and millet, but we also have soybeans, a zucchini bean, another dreaded thing, the turnip, yams, rapeseed, chestnuts and quince, apricots, peaches, Chinese cabbage, ginger, and then we have some stimulants. We have the tea, the ginseng, and the camphor. Here's what millet looks like. And then we have India, the Pacific Islands, New Guinea. We have the Asian rices. We have peas, jack bean. You're going to see some of that later. Winged bean, moth bean, rice bean, lots of different beans. Yams, taro, as I mentioned before, coconut, breadfruit, oranges and limes and tangerines and grapefruits, mango, that's my favorite, banana, and then vegetables such as cucumbers and spices such as nutmeg, and again, fiber plants, coconut, and jute. As a taro, and we're going to hopefully be able to grow some of those ourselves. I think you're going to see some flowers of taro this week in lab. That's kind of cool. The Near East, we talked about this already, having the origin of wheat, and we also have barley, rice, and oats. So some of our main grains. Pulses, which are like legumes, peas, chickpeas, lentils, lupins. There's actually only one species of lupin that's edible, just FYI. Oh, the turnip appeared again. Carrots, radishes, rapeseed, safflower, flax, olive, fruits including fig and walnut, date, palm. You guys had fresh ones on our Chinatown tour. Almonds, grapes, apples, pears, and plums. Lots of other vegetables, onions, and their relatives. I guess they're talking about green onions and shallots and that type of thing. Lettuce, saffron, we'll talk about saffron later, parsley, with stimulants that include poppy, so that's our opium, digitalis, belladonna, licorice. And look in Africa, we have rices and millets and sorghum, teff, as we mentioned before. In our pulses, we have cow beans and different kinds of ground nuts. We find yams. Yams actually occur in all sorts of different countries. There's many different species of yam. Oil palm. We're going to talk about oil palm. You're going to see castor bean in lab this week. Fruits such as baobab, watermelon, other kinds of melons, and okra. If you guys have ever had gumbo, makes gumbo slimy. Sesame, and a lot of different solanum species in the deadly nightshade family. And then this is where coffee came from. Coffee actually originated from Ethiopia, not from Colombia. And then in the New World, all sorts of neat things. So Eastern North America, Jerusalem artichoke. I think you might have seen some when you went to the botanical garden. Sunflowers, strawberries, grapes, cranberries, pecans, and tobacco came from this region. Mexico, corn, of course, is the main cereal. We have things like amaranthus, quinoa type things, chia. One of the main genus of beans, Phaseolus. We're going to see that when we do the bean family. Sweet potato, cassava, jicama, oil crops, cotton actually for fiber as well. Agave, agave for tequila. Fruits, papaya, avocado, guava, prickly pear, and vegetables, peppers, squashes, tomato, and vanilla as a spice. We're going to talk about that later. And the stimulants, cacao or cocoa. There's some wild rice. Totally different species than white rice. And in South America, we have amaranth, chenopodium, which is our quinoa, peanuts, jack bean, lupins, root crops, including cassava, jicama, oca, potato, important, oil crops, peanut and cotton again for fiber, and a whole bunch of our favorite fruits, cashews, pineapples, guavabana, cherimoya, that's related to that sugar apple we had, or custard apple that we had at Chinatown, Brazil nut, papaya, avocado, guava, and lots of different kinds of peppers, hot and not hot, and squashes, and again, and stimulants, we have coca, which is where cocaine comes from, and mate. We'll be trying some mate in class, yerba mate. There's some squash again. And this is peanut, and some of you may not realize that the peanut is actually, it flowers, but then once the flower is fertilized, it actually buries itself into the ground and the fruit develops underground. So you have to dig up peanuts, which is kind of neat. There's a fossilized one there. And then we can talk about this plant domestication, about just some stats. So there's about 2,300 cultivated plants, but 40% of them belong to 4 families. And so this is why we concentrate on certain families in this course. The grass family, the bean family or pea family, the rose family, and the Solanaceae family. If you take a look at the Poaceae, they're the grains. Fabaceae are the legumes. The Rosaceae contains all sorts of yummy stuff, including apples, peaches, plums, pears, raspberries, strawberries, blackberries, yada yada. So good. Plus roses, of course, in the Rosaceae. The Solanaceae is one of my favorite families. It's got the good, the bad, the ugly. It's good. It's got yummy things like potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, all those kinds of things. But it also has a lot of nasty things in it too, like the deadly nightshades, and we'll talk about those later on. In the Poaceae, half of the world's calories are in this group. They're the grains. These are actually little fruits that have one seed in them. And they include things like wheat, rice, corn, oats, barley, all that kind of stuff. And when we boil it down, we have about 150 really important food plants. And about 20 different species produce 90% of the world's food. So we've actually used very, very few species that are out there. And most of them were domesticated thousands of years ago. So there's been very few plants that have been on the scene since then. So today there's 14 species of plants that produce most of the world's food. So in the Poaceae, we have rice, wheat, corn, sugar cane, barley, and sorghum. So those are the main Poaceaes, but we have other members of the monocot group. Okay, so Poaceae belongs in the monocots. They include banana and plantain, coconuts. And when we take a look at the eudicots, the most important one, of course, is potatoes, sweet potatoes, manioc, or yucca, sugar beet, beans, and soybeans. So those are the main ones that we use for food. And 6 of those produce 80% of the world's food. And there they are. And you can see all of these are really, really starchy types of food. They're called the starchy staples. So these are the most important crops worldwide. And by the end of the lab this week, you actually should be able to match the crop with what part we eat. Okay? And we're going to come back and take a look at this as a group when we come back to this topic later. Now, I love traveling around the world and seeing what people eat in different countries, because a lot of times things that are really lovely we don't get exposure to. Like, for example, this tamarillo in the Solanaceae family here, a beautiful, yummy dessert made from these fruits that we don't have here. The same with this babaco, which is a relative of the papaya, and very similar to it, but hasn't had the worldwide kind of distribution as some of the other fruits have. We've already talked a little bit about plant domestication and the whole idea of selection. So humans selecting plants or qualities in plants that they find desirable, like larger seeds, like spineless plants, like lower latex. We've talked about that. And it's kind of like natural selection, survival of the fittest, where nature is putting on the selective pressures to the plants for survival. Here, humans are perpetuating features that they find desirable. And so, for example, humans, of course, are going to go for the bigger and juicier fruits. Even though we don't really know how the domestication of corn occurred, we now have these lovely kernels of corn that are yummy and delicious, wrapped up in the husks, which make it really difficult for the plant in nature to disperse its seeds. So in the process of domestication, we have eliminated some of the dispersal mechanisms of plants. We saw that the shattering of the wheat, the non-shattering, I should say, of the wheat. And here we've got a plant that's kind of locked into its husks and can't disperse. Some plants are really interesting. We've selected them for numerous things. So for example, Swiss chard, red beets, and sugar beet, which you see here is all one species. And so we've selected for different things. So for sugar beet, of course, we've selected for high sugar content. And then this is a whole bunch of one of our favorite vegetables: kale, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kohlrabi, cabbage, and cauliflower. They're actually all one species of plant. Kind of amazing, eh? But we've selected for different things. So for example, in the cabbage, we've selected for a very short stem with lots and lots of leaves, making a head of cabbage. In broccoli, we've selected for clusters of flowers. So I don't know if you've ever noticed that if you leave your broccoli in the fridge, sometimes it actually goes yellow because there's little flowers blooming, so many flowers. If we take a look at cauliflower, we have a floral head that's kind of aborted into this gnarly looking white mass. Kohlrabi, we've selected for a fat, juicy stem. And in many plants, we find we have this idea of polyploidy. So for example, rapeseed, we're going to talk about later, it's a tetraploid. It's got 4 sets of chromosomes instead of just 2. As we mentioned with some of the wheats, this wheat in particular, it's a hexaploid. It's got 6 sets of chromosomes. Sisal, the things we make string with. Coffee is a tetraploid. Banana is actually a triploid. Cotton is a tetraploid. Potatoes are tetraploid, and corn is a tetraploid. So they're all polyploids having more than 2 sets of chromosomes. We also have other ways that we propagate plants. We have artificial propagation using grafting technology, taking cuttings, doing tissue culture. We're going to talk more about tissue culture later on, actually, when we talk about genetic engineering, because that's usually one of the techniques that's used in that later on. Hybridization is the crossing or mating between different lines. And again, we're going to come back and talk about genetic engineering later, how we introduce genes into plants. Okay, well, that's about it for today. I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but I hope you enjoy this, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.